A low, pulsing beat vibrated through the plush leather of the VIP booth. Caleb found himself pinned against the cushions, Declan's arm draped heavily over his shoulders. Declan's breath, smelling of expensive whiskey, was hot against his ear. His words were a low murmur, suggesting that a kiss was the only logical conclusion to the way Caleb had been staring at him. A wave of nausea crashed over Caleb, sudden and violent. The man he'd supposedly adored, the focus of his entire world, now seemed repulsive. His cologne was suffocating, his practiced charm as thin and greasy as a film of oil on water. A strange cacophony erupted in Caleb's mind, a frantic ticker tape of text scrolling behind his eyes, thoughts that were not his own. The voice, a chorus of disembodied critics, was relentless. It lamented how this pathetic side character, this Caleb, was still fawning over a cheat while the real prize, Julian, was already with him. It sneered at his devotion, calling him a third wheel, a fool who was being played for his money and affection, destined for a grim, lonely end. The information overload was like a bolt of lightning, clearing the fog from his brain. He was a character. This was a story. A very, very bad one. He was the disposable villain, and his purpose was to lose. Declan's hand moved to his face, his expression a mask of manufactured concern over how pale Caleb looked. Caleb recoiled, jerking his head away from the touch. He felt an urgent need for distance, for clean air, for anything other than this man's suffocating presence. The inner voices screamed a 3-second countdown to Julian's arrival. The booth door swung open with a force that made the glasses on the table rattle. Julian stood silhouetted in the doorway, bringing with him a pocket of Arctic stillness. He was all sharp lines and elegant angles, his frame lean and powerful beneath a simple black sweater. His face, which Caleb had always dismissed as severe, was a study in stark, breathtaking beauty, like a marble sculpture carved by a master. The icy blue of his eyes swept over the scene, landing on Caleb nestled in Declan's embrace. In that single, piercing glance, Caleb felt his soul leave his body. He had been so profoundly, catastrophically blind. This man wasn't a bland canvas. He was a winter storm, a frozen lake hiding impossible depths. The silent commentary in his head went wild, questioning the drool he could suddenly feel pooling at the corner of his mouth, mocking the whiplash of his affections. Mortified, Caleb wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Julian's voice was low and edged with fury as he demanded to know what they were doing. A look down confirmed Caleb's horrifying position, still tangled up with Declan. He scrambled away with a yelp, retreating to the farthest corner of the booth as if the leather were on fire. Declan immediately began to spin a story, a flimsy excuse about Caleb being bored while Julian was busy with a term paper, insisting it was just two friends having a drink. Julian's laugh was a sharp, brittle sound, devoid of humor. He told Declan he was disgusting. The inner script provided context, explaining how Declan had leveraged a long-standing friendship with Caleb, keeping him on a leash while pursuing Julian, the beautiful new challenge. He wanted the comfort of the familiar and the thrill of the new, a greedy king of a tiny, pathetic kingdom. Declan rose, reaching for Julian's hand, pleading that it was all a misunderstanding, that Julian was the only one he loved. He cast a nervous, guilty look back at Caleb. A week ago, that look would have shattered Caleb's heart. Now, he felt nothing but a distant, clinical amusement. The voices in his head grew frantic, insisting that according to the script, he should be throwing himself at Declan, weeping and demanding to know why he was being abandoned. They whispered of his grisly future, of a dark, watery grave filled with sharks, a punishment for his relentless torment of Julian. The image was so vivid, so terrifying, that his blood ran cold. He met Julian's gaze across the room, and the fury he saw there felt like a physical blow. A primal fear overrode every other instinct. He stumbled forward, his knees hitting the floor in a clumsy, desperate slide. He babbled that he was innocent, a victim of Declan's manipulations, and that he had no intention of being a homewrecker. He begged Julian not to feed him to sharks. Declan stared, utterly bewildered. Julian's brow furrowed, and he asked Caleb what new brand of insanity this was. Caleb, still on the floor, insisted he wasn't crazy, just enlightened. He confessed that his past obsession had been a colossal mistake and that he was now officially and completely out of the running for Declan's affections. Suspicion clouded Julian's features. Caleb, wanting to prove his sincerity, scrambled to his feet to rush over to him. His expensive dress shoe found a slick of spilled liquor on the polished floor. His feet went out from under him, and he pinwheeled directly into Julian's arms. The inner voices erupted in a series of digital question marks, debating whether the fall was accidental or the smoothest move in history. Caleb had no time to consider it. He was drowning in the unexpected warmth of Julian's embrace, the subtle, clean scent of cedar and cold air that clung to him. His heart hammered against his ribs. Julian's face darkened, and he shoved Caleb away with a sharp command to stay away from him. The rejection stung. The inner script helpfully explained Julian's severe aversion to physical contact, a trauma so deep that even Declan, his supposed boyfriend, had never been allowed to touch him. The realization dawned on Caleb. Declan's constant physical advances toward him were a substitute for the intimacy he was denied by Julian. Declan, ever the drama queen, stepped between them, pleading with them not to fight over him, claiming it would break his heart to see either of them hurt. The commentary in Caleb's head exploded with derisive laughter, comparing Declan to an emperor watching his concubines quarrel for his favor. Julian ignored him completely. He looked at Declan, his voice flat and final, and said they were done. He hated cheaters. As Declan began to panic and plead, Julian turned and walked out, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The voices shrieked that the plot had gone off the rails, that Caleb had broken the story. But Caleb wasn't listening. He was staring at the empty doorway, his face flushed, his mind reeling. Julian was magnificent, and Caleb was going to have him. He packed a duffel bag and moved back into his dorm room that very night. It was the same room he shared with Julian, the one he had dramatically moved out of months ago in a fit of pique over their rivalry. The irony was not lost on him. The peanut gallery in his mind found it absurd, reminding him that winning Julian's heart was a quest of legendary difficulty, a 6-year ordeal for the story's original hero. They told him he didn't have that kind of time. The challenge only strengthened his resolve. The dorm was dark and quiet. His other roommate was away on an internship, leaving only Julian. He was a still form under a thin blanket, seemingly asleep. Caleb tiptoed over to his bunk, leaning in close, only to be met by a pair of wide-open, glinting eyes in the darkness. Julian was awake. Caleb offered a wide, toothy grin that felt more menacing than friendly in the shadows, announcing his return. The inner voices dryly remarked that he had turned a romance into a horror movie. Julian said nothing, simply rolling over to present Caleb with his back, a silent, unequivocal dismissal. The rejection was a physical pang, but Caleb was undeterred. He launched a relentless campaign. He brought Julian coffee every morning and left lunch at his classroom door. He sent flowers, which ended up in the trash, and wrote notes, which were likely used as scrap paper. One evening, he found his chance, slipping into Julian's bed while he was in the shower, intending to warm it for him. Julian returned, saw him, and without a word, yanked the covers off, sending Caleb tumbling to the cold floor. As Caleb nursed his bruised tailbone, Julian's voice was lethally quiet. He warned Caleb that if he didn't stop, he would die. The memory of sharks flashed in his mind. A change in tactics was needed. The next day, he arranged for 9,999 roses to be delivered to the campus quad, forming a massive heart. He stood in the middle of it, waiting. Julian appeared, his face a thundercloud of fury. He didn't ask what Caleb was doing. He demanded to know what scheme this was, how Caleb intended to hurt him this time. The accusation landed like a punch. To Julian, he would always be the villain. Caleb's bravado crumbled. He explained, his voice softer than he intended, that it wasn't a trick. He liked Julian. He wanted to be with him. Julian's skepticism was a tangible wall between them. He pointed out that just days ago, Caleb had been wrapped around Declan. Caleb couldn't deny the hypocrisy. The voices in his head agreed, wondering at the abruptness of his transformation. Why? Why the sudden change? As Caleb looked at Julian, surrounded by a sea of blood-red roses, he felt a strange sense of déjà vu, a feeling that this wasn't new. Felt as if he had loved him for years. He lunged forward, grabbing Julian's arm, the words tumbling out in a rush. He declared his epiphany, claiming he had loved Julian all along. He made his case, listing his own virtues, emotional stability, considerable wealth, and handsome features. He told Julian they were a perfect match. Julian's rejection was cold and absolute. He said he could never, ever like him. He turned to leave. A sudden, inexplicable panic seized Caleb. He grabbed Julian's hand, pulling him back. He blurted out that 9,999 roses symbolized the most profound and eternal love, his undying pledge. The moment the words left his mouth, he felt a chill. They weren't his words. The inner voices confirmed it. He had stolen the original hero's proposal line. Julian reacted as if he'd been struck. He kicked viciously at the roses, his voice a guttural roar as he told Caleb to get lost. Caleb stood frozen, watching him storm away, baffled by the sheer violence of his reaction. The voices provided the horrifying context. Roses were the favorite flower of Julian's first love. The one who had died. The one whose death had broken him, leaving him with crippling trauma and an inability to connect with anyone. Caleb had just danced on his grave. He ran after him, desperate to apologize. He caught the sleeve of Julian's jacket, promising never to give him roses again. Julian shook him off and strode on. Caleb scrambled to keep up, not watching where he was going. A campus shuttle bus swerved around a corner, its horn blaring. Julian's arm shot out, yanking Caleb back against his chest with a shouted to watch the road. Pressed against him, Caleb's hand landed on the solid wall of Julian's chest. The muscle was dense and firm. He gave an experimental squeeze. The sensation was electric. Julian's face turned a dark shade of red. Before he could shove him away again, a furious voice cut through the air. It was Declan, his face contorted in a mask of rage, asking what they thought they were doing behind his back. Julian pushed Caleb away. Declan advanced on them, his voice dripping with venom. He accused Julian of using him, of having Caleb lined up as a replacement. He claimed he'd been on his way to apologize, to try and fix things, only to find this betrayal. Julian regarded him as if he were a mildly interesting insect. Caleb, however, couldn't resist. He grinned, confirming Declan's accusation, asking him how it felt to be cheated on. Declan's face turned purple. He sputtered that Caleb used to worship him. Caleb's reply was a verbal machine gun, listing Declan's flaws. His arrogance, his possessiveness, his condescending nature, his transparent insecurities. He called him a relic and declared his own past affection a temporary form of blindness. Declan, speechless with rage, could only threaten them, promising to make them regret crossing him. Caleb just laughed. Julian cast a complicated look at him before turning and walking away, leaving Caleb's laughter to die in his throat. Later, trying to numb his frustration at a campus bar, the inner voices screamed Declan had set a trap for Julian. Caleb threw down cash for his drink and ran. He found the back room the voices directed him to and kicked open the door. Julian was on the floor, pinned by two large men, a trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. A hulking man with a fleshy face was threatening him over a $300,000 debt. He told Julian he could either pay it now or be delivered to Declan's bed. The inner script clarified that Declan had bought Julian's family's outstanding medical debts and was now calling them in all at once. Caleb saw red. He launched himself at the nearest man, fueled by pure adrenaline. He shouted that he would pay the debt. He pulled out his phone, transferred $300,000 and 250 cents into the account number the man provided, then sneered that the extra was a tip for a clown. The men, intimidated and paid, scurried away. Caleb gently helped Julian to his feet. Julian's voice was quiet when he thanked him, promising to pay him back. Caleb waved it off, saying it could be his apology for the roses. But Julian was already pulling out a pen and a napkin, meticulously writing out an IOU. He passed it to Caleb to sign. Beside Julian's sharp, elegant script, Caleb's own signature looked round and childish. They pressed their thumbs onto a smear of red ink from the napkin. Staring at the two prints side by side, Caleb murmured that it felt like they were signing a marriage license. Julian froze for a fraction of a second, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. Just then, Caleb's phone rang. It was Declan. Before he could decide what to do, Julian took the phone and ended the call. Caleb, without thinking, asked why he did that. Julian's gaze darkened. He asked if Caleb had wanted to take the call. Caleb immediately backpedaled, fumbling to block Declan's number. In his haste, he accidentally opened his photo gallery. The first picture was a selfie of him and Declan from happier times, their heads close together. He froze, feeling an overwhelming and irrational sense of guilt. The voices in his head declared him doomed. He risked a glance at Julian and found his eyes were like chips of ice. Caleb frantically deleted the photo and every other picture that included Declan, babbling apologies and promising Julian that Declan was the past, and Julian was his future, his forever. Julian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He instructed Caleb that there were to be no more pictures with him. Caleb readily agreed, adding that he only wanted to take pictures with Julian from now on. That seemed to satisfy him. The change in Julian after that night was seismic. He still didn't invite touch, but he no longer flinched from Caleb's casual contact. Sometimes, when Caleb would drape an arm over his shoulders or lean against him while they studied, a faint pink would color the tips of his ears. The inner voices were ecstatic, pointing out every tiny sign of affection, every softening of Julian's expression. Caleb's near-constant teasing eventually wore down his immune system, and he came down with a severe flu. Julian took care of him with a quiet, tireless patience. He brought him soup, checked his fever, and sat by his bed for hours. In a feverish daze, Caleb thought he heard Julian whisper, asking why he felt so much like him. Like who? The question died in his throat as he slipped back into unconsciousness. When he next woke, Julian was still there, watching him. The unguarded affection in his eyes was so potent, so raw, that Caleb was momentarily stunned. He sat bolt upright. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He asked point-blank if Julian had fallen for him. Julian's eyes widened, and he shot to his feet, denying it before practically fleeing the room. Caleb stared after him, bewildered. Why wouldn't he just admit it? The inner script supplied the answer. The ghost of his first love was too powerful. He was a beautiful, tragic memory, frozen at the moment of their happiest time together. Julian's heart was locked in that past, and he had no key to open it for someone new. Caleb felt a surge of anger, not at Julian, but at Declan. The voices explained how Declan had manipulated Julian's therapy, using his sessions to learn his weaknesses. He learned about the first love and molded himself into a pale imitation to break through Julian's defenses. He even had a therapist use hypnosis to make Julian subconsciously associate the memory of his first love with pain, forcing him to forget. The thought was monstrous. Declan hadn't just seduced Julian. He had tried to murder a memory. The stolen proposal line suddenly made perfect, sickening sense. And the him Julian had mentioned in his feverish state. That was the first love. Caleb's heart ached with a strange jealousy, but also a new determination. He had to help Julian break free from that ghost. Maybe then Julian could finally see him. He began to research using the details the voices provided. The more he uncovered about the story of Julian and his lost love, the more a cold, heavy dread settled in his stomach. The places, the phrases, the timeline, it was all eerily familiar. Then he understood. He hadn't just been ignorant of the story. He had lost a piece of his own. The memories returned in a flood. The summer he turned 18, before he was supposed to leave to study abroad in London. His family had hired a tutor to help him with his literature CRS. The day Julian arrived, a heat wave had wilted the roses in his mother's garden. Caleb was trying to water them back to life when he saw him walking up the path, backlit by the blazing sun. He was the most beautiful person Caleb had ever seen. His heart had simply stopped, then restarted at double speed. Julian's eyes were hollow then, his voice flat as he introduced himself. He carried a universe of pain inside him, a rose that had already withered on the vine. Caleb, in his youthful arrogance, decided he would be the one to make him bloom again. He learned Julian's story in pieces. A father wrongly imprisoned, a mother who took her own life under the pressure of debt collectors, a grandmother lost to cancer. Caleb made it his mission to be a relentless source of sunshine. He physically pushed the corners of Julian's mouth into a smile. He smoothed the worry lines from his forehead. He followed him around, chattering endlessly, refusing to let him wallow. He confessed his feelings impulsively and was met with a quiet, sad refusal. But Caleb persisted. He brought him food, told him terrible jokes, and every single day, he picked the most perfect rose from the garden and gave it to him. One afternoon, in the shade of the porch, surrounded by the scent of roses, one of them had leaned in. The kiss was hesitant and sweet, full of sunlight. They fell in love, fast and hard, over a single magical summer. Then came autumn and his departure date. Julian grew quiet, convinced the distance would break them. To reassure him, Caleb made a promise. He swore he would come back and propose with 9,999 roses, a symbol of a love so strong it couldn't be broken. If he failed, he would be cursed to never find true love again. They sealed it with a deep, desperate kiss. He boarded the plane. It never reached its destination. script fell from the sky, and he fell into darkness. A year later, he woke up in a hospital bed with no memory of the boy with the sad eyes and the rose garden. Caleb's eyes slowly opened. He was back in his dorm bed, the fever broken. Julian was sitting beside him, his expression fraught with worry. When he saw Caleb was awake, his face flooded with relief. Caleb reached out and touched his cheek. He said his name, the one he had used all those years ago, the one that belonged only to them. Julian froze, his entire body going rigid. The inner voices went into a state of shock. The script completely shattered. A villainous side character was the hero's long-lost white moonlight. Julian's arms wrapped around him, holding him with a desperate strength, his voice breaking as he repeated that Caleb wasn't dead. Caleb held him back, whispering the story of the crash, the amnesia, the strange awakening in a life that wasn't his. With every word, Julian's grip tightened. When he finished, Caleb asked how Julian had remembered him, knowing Declan had tried to erase him. The voices explained that while Caleb was unconscious, Julian had found his research notes, and seeing it all laid out had shattered the hypnotic suggestion. Julian pulled back, his hands framing Caleb's face, his thumbs stroking his cheekbones. He said that thank God he had come back. Caleb smiled. Of course he came back. He still owed him 9,998 roses. Julian's eyes shone. He told Caleb he had already given them to him, even when neither of them knew who the other was. Caleb pouted, reminding Julian how cruelly he had rejected them. Julian looked genuinely panicked for a second before Caleb laughed, admitting he was teasing. He would never hurt him, he said. After all, Julian was his rose, the one he had personally nursed back to life. After that, Julian was a constant, grounding presence. If Caleb was out of his sight for more than a few minutes, he would find Julian pacing restlessly. He followed Caleb from room to room in their off-campus apartment, a silent human shadow. On the sprawling couch, Julian would insist on sitting so close their sides were pressed together, his arm always wrapped around Caleb. At night, he held him as if afraid Caleb might evaporate by morning. The inner voices commented that he wasn't cold and distant at all. He was a furnace. The peace was shattered by a phone call from Declan. Caleb answered on speakerphone by accident. Declan's frantic voice demanded to know where Julian was. Julian's arms tightened around Caleb's waist. Caleb, enjoying himself immensely, replied that Julian was a little busy at the moment, wrapped up in his arms. After a moment of stunned silence, Declan's voice returned, laced with disgust. He called them repulsive. Julian took the phone. Declan's tone immediately shifted to pathetic begging, asking for a file. The voices filled Caleb in. Julian had uncovered evidence of massive tax fraud within Declan's family company, enough to ruin them. The original story had him using it against Caleb's family. The thought sent a jolt of fear through him. Julian, on the phone, was dismissive. Declan tried to leverage their past, pleading that he had helped cure Julian's psychological issues. Julian's voice turned to steel. He informed Declan that if it weren't for his meddling, he wouldn't have wasted so many years without the person he loved. He gave Declan a 3-day deadline before the file went to the federal authorities, and then hung up. The end came 2 days later. Caleb was walking home from a friend's house when a black van screeched to a halt. The last thing he remembered was the sickly sweet smell of chloroform. He woke to the smell of salt and diesel. He was suspended by a rope over the dark, churning ocean. On the deck of a yacht above him stood Declan. He explained, with a sigh of false regret, that Caleb was his last resort. He was certain Julian would trade the file for Caleb's life. Caleb spat that Julian wouldn't come. Declan just shook his head, a crazed certainty in his eyes. He knew he would. He had to. Julian arrived like a vengeful god, a silhouette against the stormy sky. Declan held up a remote control him to stay back. He gestured to the water below, where the dark shapes of sharks were circling. Julian didn't stop. He walked forward, his eyes locked on Declan. As Declan's trembling finger went for the button, Julian moved with impossible speed, kicking the remote into the sea. They clashed. The fight was short and brutal. A misplaced step, a powerful shove from Julian, and Declan tumbled over the railing into the water. The sharks converged. The water turned black, then red. It was over. Julian cut him down, pulling him into an embrace that was shaking with the aftermath of terror and rage. By the time they reached the shore, the storm had passed, and the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, washing the memory of red from the sea. Caleb breathed in the clean, salty air. He said that after everything, it was a miracle they were still standing here, together. Julian's hand found his, their fingers lacing together tightly. He agreed, his voice thick with emotion. He had always been by his side. Caleb looked at the man beside him. His first love, his rival, his enemy, his salvation. The chaotic script that had governed his life had finally gone silent. They were free. He grinned, asking where they should go for their honeymoon. Julian smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips. He said that before any trip, he had a promise to keep, a proposal he was long overdue to give. Caleb laughed, surging forward to capture that smile with his own. Behind them, the sun broke free of the horizon, flooding the world with brilliant, unending light.